If you were a young and wealthy investment banker who was secretly hiding an irresistible urge to kill, what would you do? By day, this Wall Street finance bro is trying his best to fit in, but by night, he's out searching for the kind of thrill that money can't buy. I'm gonna break down the mistakes made, what you should do, and how to beat Patrick Bateman, the boardroom butcher, in American Psycho. There's an insane serial killer roaming the streets of New York City, and he's the last person that anyone would suspect. One evening at a fancy restaurant downtown, this rich banker, Patrick Bateman, and his 3 associates meet for dinner, while his friends complain that they can't get reservations to a nicer place, discuss office politics, and talk smack about the other guests. Patrick here scolds them for their disrespectful behavior, but what none of them realize is he's actually the most twisted one in the group. Later that night, he and his friends go to an exclusive nightclub and bribe their way inside. Patrick quickly gets in an argument with the bartender and starts making nasty remarks about how he'd like to kill her straight to her face while smiling the whole time, knowing that he can get away with it because of his status. The next morning, he goes about his daily routine almost robotically, carefully repeating the same steps every day. He takes very good care of himself, eating a healthy diet, exercising, and going through a rigorous skincare routine to keep himself looking young. But the truth is that it's all just a disguise. In reality, he feels no connection to the world around him, and even though he hides it well, in his mind, it's as if he isn't really there. Arriving at his day job, Patrick power walks into his office listening to loud, cheery music with his headphones, and right past his unsuspecting secretary, Jean. She reminds him of the different appointments that he has scheduled for the day, but he tells her to cancel them all. On her way out, she compliments his appearance, but instead of saying thank you, he rudely tells her not to wear this outfit again, saying that tomorrow she should wear something that makes her look prettier. Later, Patrick takes a cab to dinner with his fiancée, Evelyn, who he secretly has no real feelings for. He sits there zoning out and listening to some music while she talks to herself about their wedding plans, getting annoyed when she asks him for his opinion and saying that he can't take the time off of work. Even though he hates her and his job, he tolerates them both purely out of the desire to fit in. At the restaurant, Evelyn introduces him to her weird goth cousins and happily accepts some inappropriate kisses from his coworker, Timothy Bryce. Patrick suspects, but ultimately doesn't care that the two of them are having an affair, because he himself is doing the same thing with her best friend Courtney, who's engaged to another of his associates, Lewis, a man who he thinks is a huge dork. They talk about some local and global politics over their meal, and Patrick starts going off about all the ways that he would improve the world, saying things that seem intelligent, although it's really all surface level stuff. Impressed, Lewis here happily eats it up, but Bryce laughs, knowing that he's full of crap. Later that night, Patrick is taking some cash out of the ATM when he sees a woman walk by all alone, and starts following her down the street. Stopping next to her at the corner, he smiles and introduces himself before luring her back to his apartment and killing her. Okay, this woman just made the worst mistake of her life. We don't actually get to witness exactly what happened to her, but based on what we can see in this next scene, it's clear that she ended up as Patrick's most recent victim. You know, there's a reason why we all learned in school never to talk to strangers, even if they're wearing a suit that's worth more than you make in a month. Now, this mostly goes for young kids who could easily be taken advantage of by a smarter and stronger adult. But it also applies when you're out walking through the streets of New York City all alone in the middle of the night. Although he might seem harmless at first glance, the truth is that you never know what a person is really like until they want you to know. And when it comes to Patrick Bateman here, by the time that he shows you his true colors, it's already much too late. This lady made the same mistakes as everyone else in Patrick's life and trusted his outward appearance without ever realizing that she was really looking into the eyes of a psychotic killer. But what could she have done differently? Imagine this. You're walking alone at night when you pass by a man who speeds up until you're standing next to each other at the corner while waiting for the light. Is it just a coincidence, or is it time to get concerned? The first warning sign here is his focus. Under these conditions, if you notice a person staring you down, then there's a good chance that they've chosen you as their next target and are planning out their opportunity to strike. The next thing to do is adjust your pace by walking faster or slower than normal to try and throw them off. In this case, Patrick here waited for his victim to start moving and then matched her pace exactly, a sure sign that he was following her. Now it's time to take action, which means getting to a more public area as quickly as possible, confronting the stalker if necessary, and being ready to defend yourself if he decides to attack. That way, you won't end up as yet another helpless victim of this white-collar killer. Now to me, this is why it's always important to travel with a group, because not only stalkers much less likely to go after you, but you'll also have some handy meat shields around in case things take a turn for the worse. Remember that saying, you don't have to run faster than the bear to get away, you just have to run faster than the guy next to you? Well, this also applies to maniacs in suits and ties lurking around in the city streets. In any survival situation, it never hurts to have some friends around, especially friends who can't run as fast as you can. Now, I understand that she might not have wanted to pass up on the opportunity to get with a guy who was clearly worth a lot of money, but instead of following him back to his apartment right then and there, she could have simply asked him for his phone number instead, and scheduled a date for later at a more public place, so that she could get to know him before taking any chances. Of course, we know that Patrick is just going to put on his act until he finally gets you to let your guard down, which is exactly when he's going to strike. But hopefully, meeting in public would have given her the chance to pick up on his psycho vibes before it was too late. In the morning, he takes his blood-stained bed sheets to a dry cleaner and argues with them about not damaging the material. A woman who recognizes him happens to walk in and asks him what caused the stains. So he lies and says that it was spilled cranberry juice. She doesn't really believe it, but likes him too much to ask any more questions, and even asks him to go out for lunch sometime, which he declines. Patrick goes back to his apartment and calls up Courtney, bad-mouthing her boyfriend, and demanding that she joins him for dinner that night. At first, she says that she can't, until he promises to take her to the most exclusive restaurant in town. She finally agrees, but when he calls the place and asks for a reservation, the receptionist only laughs and hangs up the phone. They end up having to go to another place, but the woman is too bent on prescription medication to notice the difference anyway. Patrick decides what he's going to order for her, and Courtney sleepily thanks him as she nods off in her chair. Sometime later, Patrick takes a seat next to Lewis at a board meeting, and he thanks him for taking his fiancée out to dinner, impressed that he managed to get reservations at such an exclusive location. Complimenting his suit, Lewis reaches out and touches his shoulder, but Patrick quickly slaps his hand away. Just then, his more successful coworker, Paul Allen, approaches them, mistaking Patrick for somebody else. Instead of correcting him, Patrick decides to just go along with it, chatting with Paul until the rest of the guys arrive. On his way out, Paul hands Bryce his business card and mentions that he has reservations that Friday at Dorsia, the restaurant where Patrick couldn't get a table. Deciding to show off his new business card too, Patrick happily accepts his friend's compliments on the design, only to get furious when another one of the guys one-ups him. Nervously, he asks to see Paul Allen's card, and is almost sick with jealousy at how nice that he thinks it is, even though it's barely any different than the others. That night, he stalks through the empty city streets, searching for a victim to release his murderous rage. He finds a homeless man sleeping down a dark alley, and earns his trust by offering the man money and food. But in an instant, his mask of kindness slips off. Crouching down in front of him, Patrick insults the man for not having a job or being able to take care of himself, before looking around to make sure that no one's watching, pulling a knife from his briefcase and brutally killing both the man and his dog. Okay, this poor guy never even saw it coming. Honestly, you can't blame him for wanting to believe that his luck was finally turning around and that Patrick genuinely wanted to help. He really didn't have much of a reason to suspect that his life was in danger until it was already too late. But with that being said, here's some ideas for what he could have done differently, and how he could have given Patrick a taste of his own medicine. If you want to make it on the mean streets of the Big Apple, then you need to learn to live by the law of the jungle, which means always staying on your toes and being ready to do whatever it takes to survive. When interacting with strangers, it's essential to be on the lookout for any red flags that might indicate their true intentions. For example, what's a wealthy investment banker doing walking down this dark alley all alone so late at night? I get that we're in the neighborhood where they do business by day, but at this hour, and dressed the way that he is, he sticks out like a sore thumb. He clearly has the money to hire a cab to take him wherever he needs to go, so the fact that he's walking down this alleyway as if he's just begging to get robbed shows me that he's secretly up to no good. And personally, I'd be on my guard right away. Now, whatever promises that he might have made at first, as soon as he started talking smack about my personal hygiene, I would have fired back with a few nasty comments of my own. Like calling him a trust fund baby with a big mouth and an overpriced haircut. If he got confrontational, then it would be time for a good old-fashioned Brooklyn beatdown. First, you need to sweep his legs, and then ground and pound him like a UFC cage match before he even knows what's going on. Patrick Bateman here is pretty ripped, so it's gonna be a tough battle. But based on the people who he chooses as his targets, it's pretty clear that he's not looking for a fair fight, which is why you need to strike while you still have the element of surprise working in your favor. Remember, this is a cold-blooded killer that we're dealing with, so anything and everything is pretty much fair game. Once he was incapacitated, I'd take his expensive suit and his fancy watch and show up to one of these investment firms the next morning, find an empty office, and just start claiming that I worked there. None of these finance bros seem to be paying enough attention to catch on anyway. And even if they did, I'd probably at least be able to swindle a few free meals out of it before the jig was up. As the old saying goes, when life hands you lemons, make lemonade. And if we're thinking creatively, I see no reason why we couldn't turn this into a major win. The next day, Patrick goes to a spa and gets a facial as if nothing happened, thinking to himself about how his bloodlust is getting worse, and worrying that soon he might completely lose control. At a Christmas party, he runs into Paul Allen, and the two of them make plans to meet up for dinner, but that was Paul's biggest mistake. By the time that Patrick gets to the restaurant, Paul is already there, and they aggressively order their drinks before telling the waiter to beat it. Paul immediately starts making fun of the place, saying that he could have gotten them a table at Dorsia instead. Changing the subject, Patrick asks him how he landed a specific high-profile account, but Paul jokes that if he told him, then he'd have to kill him, having no idea what Patrick secretly has planned. After a few drinks, Patrick starts openly telling Paul about his murderous desires, but the man is already too messed up to listen. Paul, who still thinks that he's having dinner with a completely different person, brings Patrick up from work and calls him a loser, but Patrick only laughs and orders him another drink. The two head back to Patrick's apartment, where he starts going off about a band he likes called Huey Lewis and the News. While Paul nods off on the couch, Patrick goes to the bathroom, puts on a rain jacket, and grabs a shiny chrome axe. As he moonwalks back into the room, Paul starts asking why he has newspapers taped to the floor and his furniture covered with cloth. But Patrick ignores his questions, and by now, it's already too late. Grabbing the axe, he finishes his thoughts about the music before getting Paul's attention, raising the axe above his head and bringing it down into the man's back with an insane scream the moment that he turns around. After hacking the man to pieces, he decides to sit down and smoke a cigar, feeling extremely satisfied now that the job is done. Okay, Patrick here was clearly holding a grudge against this guy for quite a while, and it looks like he has a very different idea of what it means to bury the hatchet. Sorry, I just couldn't help myself. Paul was a little too wrapped up in his own little world to see the warning signs right in front of him, and now he's going to be wrapped up in a body bag instead. There's really only one thing to say here, Paul Allen, and it's you f***ed up. Let's start back at the board meeting where you first ended up on Patrick's hit list. You were so preoccupied with yourself that you didn't even realize that you were speaking to someone completely different from who you thought. Even though they don't look that much alike, and the guy you mistook Patrick for was standing right there on the other side of the room. The fact that you couldn't tell from his confused reaction that you'd made a mistake just goes to show how self-obsessed that you really are. Now, passive-aggressively insulting his business dealings and making slightly questionable comments about his girlfriend would have been bad enough. But your biggest mistake of all was casually bragging about how you'd managed to get a reservation at Dorsia to the entire room. This might have impressed your buddies and given you a bit of that self-satisfaction that you're clearly after, but what you didn't realize is that saying this in front of Patrick here would send him into a jealous rage that could only be satisfied with blood. It helps to be humble after all, especially when you're in the room with a secret serial killer. The crazy thing is, Patrick didn't even try to keep it a secret for very long. Once he lured you into that restaurant and got you a few drinks deep, he told you straight up that he likes to murder women in his free time. But as usual, you were too busy thinking about the next way you could brag about yourself to notice the red flags right in front of you. He even slipped up and said his real name before quickly correcting himself, but somehow that blew right over your head. And not 15 minutes later, you're unknowingly calling the guy a dork straight to his face. Talk about adding fuel to the fire. If he wasn't entirely committed to murdering you yet, then this was pretty much the moment where you signed your own death warrant. Somehow, you managed to get so messed up at a casual business dinner that when he brought you back to his apartment, and you noticed that the place was set up like a Dexter kill room, you decided to crack jokes about it instead of, I don't know, maybe running for your life? I mean, come on, man! No matter what you tell yourself in the mirror every morning, the truth is that no one is too young and too successful to die. You, of all people, should know that this is a cutthroat business. And it looks like Patrick here decided to take that literally. It's one thing to be a little self-absorbed from time to time, but when your life ends with your blood being absorbed by cutout sections of the newspaper, Paul Allen, you f***ed up. Stuffing Paul into a duffel bag, Patrick drags him out through the lobby, leaving a bloody trail on the floor, and goes right past the security guard, who notices but doesn't say a word. While he's stuffing the body into the trunk of a cab, Lewis happens to come walking by and stops to compliment the bag without ever asking what's in it. Patrick makes his way to Paul's apartment, where he immediately gets upset when he realizes that it's more expensive than his and has a better view. Grabbing his suitcase, he packs up a bunch of Paul's things before leaving a message on his answering machine that makes it look like he's taken a short notice trip to London. The next day, Patrick is listening to some music in his office and gets annoyed when his secretary says that there's a detective there to see him. He wants her to say that he's out to lunch, but she points that it's only 10:30 and the detective knows that he's here, so he reluctantly tells her to send him in. Picking up the phone, he pretends to be giving some advice to a coworker as the man enters the room. The detective asks if he's interrupted something important, and Patrick here goes into a long-winded but meaningless explanation. After an awkward chuckle, the man introduces himself as Detective Kimball, saying that he's been hired by Paul's girlfriend to investigate his disappearance. Patrick says that he hasn't heard anything, so instead, the detective asks him some general questions about himself and how well that he knew Paul, quizzing him on things like where the man liked to spend his free time and where he went to school. After a few questions, Patrick points out that the detective should know all of this already, and he responds that he does. He just wanted to see how much Patrick knew. Now it's Patrick who starts asking the questions, curious to know if the detective has any evidence that would point to a suspect, and if the police are officially involved yet. Kimball brings up the message saying that Paul went to London and adds that people actually have reported seeing him there, although he hasn't been able to verify their stories. Still, he thinks that the circumstances are very suspicious, and Patrick answers him back strangely, briefly letting his guard down. They sit in awkward silence for a moment until Patrick mentions that he has a lunch meeting in 20 minutes and has to get going, the detective pointing out that the restaurant is uptown and he's going to be late, but Patrick insisting that they have another location nearby, shaking the man's hand and promising to give him a call if he thinks of any more helpful information. Okay, Patrick is lying straight to this man's face. And although he doesn't know the truth yet, it looks like the detective can tell that something isn't quite right. During their conversation, Patrick here slipped up in a lot of ways that would cause me to be immediately suspicious. For example, when the detective asked him about his fake phone call, he quickly launched into a long-winded and unnecessarily detailed explanation, which is a sure sign that somebody is lying. He also asked twice about why the detective was paying him a visit, and when he mentioned that he was there investigating Paul Allen's disappearance, Patrick simultaneously acted like he knew what he was talking about, but also hadn't heard anything about it. Once he realized why the man was there, Patrick continuously interrupted the flow of the conversation by asking him if he wanted something to drink, and insisted on getting him something, even though the detective said that that wasn't necessary. Then, when it came time to talk about Paul, he immediately started attacking his character, trying to make it look as if he often got himself involved in dangerous situations. The detective has probably been interviewing other finance bros all day who can barely pick each other out of a lineup, even though they all work together in the same building and see each other all of the time. But when it comes to Patrick here, He seems to know every little detail about Paul's personal life, despite the fact that he says they hardly knew each other. Because of all this suspicious behavior, if I was Detective Kimball, Patrick would have just become my prime suspect. Before moving on, I would have waited outside of the building for him to leave work and tailed him to see what else I could find out. There's 3 good possibilities for what could happen next. First, he might return to the scene of the crime and do something suspicious, which would give me strong evidence to make my case with. Alternatively, now that he knows that there's a detective involved, he could get nervous and lead me straight to Paul Allen's body, trying to cover it up, at which point I'd have caught him red-handed. Finally, if I tracked him down at night, I might catch him in the process of going after his next victim, which would not only help me prove his guilt, but it could also save someone else's life. If it were me, I'd be keeping close tabs on Patrick from now on, and try to bring him to justice before he has the chance to strike again. That night, Patrick takes his limo to a seedy part of town and finds this working girl standing out on the corner. He asks her to come back to his apartment, which the girl says that she isn't supposed to, but after he waves some money around, she finally agrees. On the drive over, he calls up a service and tells them to send another girl, introducing himself as Paul Allen and saying that he's going to call her Christy. When they get to his apartment, Patrick has Christy take a bath and gives her a glass of wine, before going to the door to get the other girl, who he decides to call Sabrina. As the girls settle in, Patrick puts on an album by Phil Collins and starts talking about it just like he did when he killed Paul. Summoning them into the bedroom, they all engage in some adult activities while Patrick admires himself in a large mirror on the wall. After a while, the girls say that they want to leave, but Patrick goes to a drawer full of torture weapons and takes out a wire hanger, saying that he isn't done with them yet. By the time that he finally lets them go, they're both scratched up, bloody, and clearly upset with whatever just happened. The next day, Patrick and the boys head down to a high-class bar and sit around making low-class comments about women. That's when Lewis joins the group and does the one thing that you should absolutely never do, showing Patrick his new business card. Patrick, of course, instantly flies into a jealous rage, snapping at his friends and getting up to follow Lewis to the bathroom. Inside, he finds Lewis at the urinal, sneaking up behind him and wrapping his trembling hands around his throat. Instead of freaking out, Lewis turns around and kisses his wrist, thinking that Patrick is making romantic advances and saying that he's into it. Disgusted, Patrick goes to the sink and washes his gloves, storming out of the bar as Lewis signals that he'll call him later. Patrick heads back to his office, where he sees Detective Kimball already waiting for him and double-checking his recent appointments with his secretary. Sitting down at his desk, the detective asks him if he can remember where he was on the night of Paul's disappearance. Patrick answers that he was out on a date, but the detective says that his story doesn't match up with the information that he's already gathered. Nervous, Patrick tries to figure out what information he has, but Kimball changes the subject, asking him when he last saw Paul instead. Patrick tells him that they went to dinner and a musical, apologizing for not being able to remember things accurately and saying that he's had a long day. The detective decides to schedule a lunch meeting for next week to give him time to go over his information, telling Patrick to do his best to remember where he was on the night that Paul disappeared. Just before leaving, Kimball pulls out the exact CD that Patrick was listening to when he killed Paul, but he says that he's never heard of it. That night, Patrick and the boys go to a Halloween party at a nightclub and sit down for some drinks with a group of models. Trying to make some small talk, one of the girls asks Patrick what he does for a living, and he openly tells her that he's into murders and executions. She's only half listening, thinking that he said mergers and acquisitions. And just like that, Patrick sets his eyes on her as his next target. He hits her with that psychopath Riz game, and after a while, they both take a cab back to his apartment, where he kills her in cold blood. Okay, once again, we have another example of someone who ignored the obvious warning signs and ended up paying the price, even though Patrick told her straight to her face exactly what he was planning to do. Obviously, just listening to the guy and what he said would have potentially saved her life here. but he wisely chooses victims who he knows are too caught up in their own little worlds to pick up on his true intentions. Once she was caught in the trap, the woman's death was pretty much guaranteed, but while they were at the party, there was something Patrick did that gives me an idea for how his future victims might survive if they think creatively. While he was in the bathroom with his friends, we saw that Patrick here likes to indulge in some illegal substances from time to time. So if you had the opportunity to mix in something dangerous, you might be able to take Patrick out without ever having to lift a finger. It's a dirty tactic, but you have to remember who we're dealing with here. Patrick is about the most heartless and cold-blooded murderer that it's possible to be. So when it comes to putting him out of business for good, there's really no strategy that I wouldn't consider. Now, of course, this would require you to catch on to what's happening before it's too late, and also have the opportunity to sneak something in his stash without him noticing, which makes it a huge long shot. But as always, we need to consider all of our options when it's a matter of life or death. The next day at his office, Patrick is playing with some strands of the woman's blonde hair, quickly hiding them when his secretary walks into the room. He's been doing a crossword puzzle, but instead of filling it with the correct answers, he covers the whole page in the words meat and bones. At first, Patrick doesn't even look up, but just as Jean is about to leave, he asks her if she'd like to join him for dinner, offering her the choice of going any place that she wants. Thinking about it, she chooses Doria, and Patrick picks up the phone to call them on the spot. The restaurant says that they're completely booked, but he pretends that he got the reservation, telling her to meet him at his place for drinks before they go. That evening, Patrick offers Jean some ice cream from his freezer, where he's also keeping the head of the model who he killed the night before. While she sits down on the couch, he goes through the kitchen looking over potential murder weapons, distracting her by asking her what she wants to do with her life. Going to the closet, Patrick takes out a roll of duct tape and tells Jean a fun fact about the name of Ted Bundy's dog, but is visibly disappointed when she says that she doesn't know who that is. She notices the tape, which he barely even tries to cover up, but she ignores it anyway, and he asks her to keep sharing more details about herself, as he walks up behind her and holds a nail gun to the back of her head. Jean here doesn't even turn around to see what he's doing, but just as he's about to pull the trigger, Evelyn calls and leaves a message on his answering machine. Embarrassed, Jean asks Patrick if he wants her to go, and he replies that he thinks she should, saying that if she stays, then he might hurt her. On her way out, she reminds him that he has a meeting with the detective the next day, and he thanks her as she leaves. Patrick meets up with Kimball for lunch, and the detective explains that on the night that Paul disappeared, he was supposed to be having dinner with a coworker named Marcus Halberstram, but Marcus denies it, and his alibi checked out clean. Getting nervous, Patrick here asks where Marcus says that he was, and Kimball replies that the man was at a club with a group of colleagues, including Patrick himself. Patrick laughs and says that he remembers it now, explaining that he must have had his dates mixed up. The detective is sure that he'll turn up somewhere, joking at the idea that one of his friends would kill him for no reason, but Patrick here doesn't find it very funny. That night, Patrick pulls up on Christy looking for another date, but she doesn't want anything to do with him, saying how she had to go to the hospital after last time. Insisting that she'll be safe, he lures her in with a wad of cash and tries to give her a drink. Keeping her distance, she says that she might need surgery after what he did to her and is thinking about getting a lawyer, but Patrick tells her not to do that and instead writes her a check on the spot. As soon as it's in her hands, she jumps out of the car and starts walking down the street, but Patrick tells her driver to follow her, whistling at her and waving some more cash out of the open window. Realizing that he isn't going to give up, she goes to the car and reaches for the money, but he opens the door and makes her get in, promising to give her half now and half later. This time they go to Paul Allen's apartment, where they meet Patrick's friend, a woman named Elizabeth. While the girls get to know each other, he crushes up some prescription medication and dumps the powder into a bottle of wine before pouring them each a glass. Elizabeth brings up the guy who disappeared, asking Patrick if they were friends, but he quickly changes the subject, pouring them some more drinks and saying that he wants to watch the two of them get it on. At first, they both refuse, but after he pressures them into drinking more of the wine, they eventually start making out on the couch. While they're doing their thing, Patrick starts going off about music again, this time regaling them with some philosophy about his favorite Whitney Houston song. The three of them head to the bedroom for some more adult activities, and while Patrick's distracted, Christy decides that it's time to sneak out. As she grabs her things, she notices blood on the sheets, and the other woman starts to struggle. Suddenly, Patrick turns to face her with a crazed look in his eyes and blood covering his face and mouth. Terrified, Christy runs for her life, opening a door that she thinks is the exit, only to realize that it's actually a closet with the bodies of two other women hanging up inside. The girl screams and slams the door, running into another room that's full of even more blood and dead bodies, just as Patrick rounds the corner wielding a chainsaw and wearing nothing but a pair of sneakers. Circling back through the apartment, Christy makes it to the bathroom and slips in the blood of yet another dead woman. But before she can get up, Patrick rushes in behind her and takes a bite out of her ankle. She quickly hits him with a hard kick in the face, and finally manages to make it to the hallway, screaming at the top of her lungs. She sprints down the hall, slamming on every door and begging for help, but nobody lets her in. With no other option, she finds her way to the staircase and starts running down. That's when Patrick comes after her with the chainsaw, holding it over the railing and waiting until just the right moment before letting it go, dropping it directly into her back and screaming with twisted satisfaction as she falls to the ground dead. Okay, this is genuinely a worst nightmare type of scenario. Poor Christy here knew in her gut that she couldn't trust this creep, but sadly, she let the pressure of missing out on a big payday lead her right into his trap. Although, the best way to survive would have been to just run for her life as soon as she saw that limo pull up. Once Patrick had her back in his apartment, there was still a few things that she could have done differently that might have allowed her to escape unharmed. First off, it would have been smart to refuse any drinks that he tried to offer her. Sure, he might get insulted and kick her out, but considering where the night ended up going, that would have actually been the best possible outcome. She'd still have half the money that he promised, since he gave that to her already, plus the first wad of cash that he handed her back out on the street, so that should be enough to keep her going for a while. Now, as soon as she heard Elizabeth mention that someone connected with Patrick had mysteriously disappeared a few weeks earlier, that would have been the moment to get the hell out of that apartment, especially after what he did to her the last time. Sure enough, once they started getting down and dirty, Patrick's true intentions finally came to the surface. At this point, Christy only really had two options: run or fight. Unfortunately, she wasn't thinking very clearly and was unfamiliar with the layout of the apartment, which made it difficult to quickly find her way out. I get that this was an intense situation, but it's not like she was blindfolded until they got to the bedroom. So if she'd been more alert, she could have remembered her way back to the exit. The kitchen and living room were full of glass bottles and decorative statues that she could have used to defend herself if she wanted to fight. The only problem is, Patrick here was wielding a chainsaw, which means that running is pretty much your best bet. Once she got out into the hallway, instead of screaming for help, what she should have done was yell "fire!" or search for a fire alarm to pull. Most people would be too afraid to get involved when someone's screaming bloody murder outside of their door. But if they thought that their own lives might be in danger, anyone who was home would quickly pour out into the hallway, providing her with plenty of witnesses and cover while she made her escape. Alternatively, instead of yelling anything at all, she could have tried slipping out of sight and quietly hiding somewhere until Patrick passed by, and she had a clear shot to the exit. When it comes to that chainsaw drop, this seems pretty obvious, but seriously, just look up and don't run directly under the damn thing. If she waited for him to line up the shot and then just stopped in her tracks, it would have missed her completely. And then not only would she still be alive, but if the thing still worked after the fall, then she'd have a very powerful weapon to defend herself with if Patrick kept coming after her. She was so close to the finish line, but unfortunately now she's just another one of this sicko's victims. It looks like Patrick here is only getting braver, and now it's time for the real rampage to begin. The next day, while at a restaurant with his fiancée, Patrick doodles out the murder scene with some crayons and explains to her that his murderous urges are only getting stronger every day. As usual, she's not listening until Patrick tells her that he wants to break up. At first, Evelyn tries to brush it off and change the subject, but Patrick insists that he's serious, telling her that any connection that she thinks they ever shared was completely one-sided. The woman starts to cry and causes a scene, drawing attention from everyone in the restaurant, and he decides that it's time to go, saying that he needs to return some videotapes, and leaving her at the table alone. Patrick goes to an ATM to take out some cash, noticing a kitten meowing at his feet and picking it up. Just then, he hallucinates that the machine says, "Feed me a stray cat." And so he holds the kitten up to the card slot and draws a pistol from its jacket, holding the weapon to its head. But just as he's about to pull the trigger, an old woman comes up and tries to stop him. So he shoots her once in the chest instead, killing her instantly. Hearing the gunshot, a nearby police car throws on its sirens, and Patrick sprints down the road, desperately setting off every car alarm to try and cause a distraction, before quickly ducking into a side alley and running over to the next street. Before he can get far, 2 more squad cars pull up to cut him off, and he immediately opens fire, exchanging rounds with the officers until he hits the car's gas tank, causing a huge explosion that seems to kill them all. Fleeing the scene, he cuts through the lobby of a nearby office building, shooting the security guard in the head while he passes by the front desk. As he goes to leave through the back exit, he notices a custodian getting off an elevator and spins back around through the revolving door to shoot him too, before running back outside. Finally, Patrick makes it to his own office building, signing in at the front desk and taking the elevator up to his office. As a police helicopter buzzes by outside, he grabs his phone, calls his lawyer, and begins hysterically admitting to all of his crimes. Crying, he says that he's killed dozens of people, including Paul Allen, whose body is currently dissolving in a bathtub somewhere in the neighborhood of Hell's Kitchen. He filmed many of the crimes, and even tried to cook some of his victims, saying how he ate some of their brains. This time, he doesn't think that he's going to get away with it, so he wants to meet up and talk about it tomorrow. The next morning, Patrick goes about his usual routine before heading over to Paul's apartment, planning to clean up as much of the evidence that he can. To his surprise, he finds that the place is already spotless, and the bodies in the closet are gone. A realtor approaches him, asking if he saw her advertisement for the rental in the Times, and he replies that he did, but she immediately says that there was no ad in the Times. She tells him to leave and never come back, and he promises that he won't, telling her not to worry. Going to a payphone, he calls up Jean and hysterically tells her that he won't be making it to the office this afternoon. Concerned, she goes to his desk and starts going through his things, where she finds a notebook full of horrific drawings of all of his victims. Meanwhile, Patrick goes to a restaurant and meets up with his associates, doing his best to appear like everything's normal. Spotting his lawyer across the bar, he goes over to him and asks if he got his message. At first, the man doesn't even recognize him, thinking that he's someone else and asking how the voicemail was a great joke. The lawyer tries to walk away, but Patrick stops him, insisting that it's really him and everything that he said was 100% true. Sternly, the man responds that it's impossible because he had dinner with Paul Allen in London a few days ago. Suddenly, Patrick realizes that he's not the only one living a double life. The truth is that everyone in his circle is constantly lying to get ahead, and the corruption runs so deep that it would be impossible for him to ever actually be found out. Despite everything that's happened, he won't be caught, and his rampage can only continue. Did any of that happen, or was it just a really interesting, elaborate dream on the part of our protagonist? Antagonist? Let us know down in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. Leave a like and subscribe, and check out the How to Beat playlist for more videos just like this. Also be sure to check out The Kill Plan, the new show which just launched on the channel. It's awesome. And until next time, have a damn good day.